When winning means destroying yourself, victory becomes poison. Look at your phone, your laptop, the shirt you're wearing. Chances are, somewhere on the supply chain, there's a factory in China that made it cheaper than anyone else could. For 40 years, that was China's superpower. The ability to manufacture anything for anyone at a price no one could match. Cities rose from rice paddies, highways cut through mountains. A nation of farmers became a nation of factory workers, and the world celebrated the miracle. But miracles don't last, they mutate. And China's greatest strength, the relentless drive to produce more, faster, and cheaper than everyone else, has become a trap it can't escape. This is the story of how efficiency becomes self-destruction, how competition turns cannibalistic, how an empire built on making everything is now choking on its own abundance. December 1978, Beijing. Deng Xiaoping stands before the Communist Party and says something no one expected. To get rich is glorious, 4 words that shattered decades of ideology. Socialism had promised equality through shared poverty. Deng offered something else, wealth through competition. And with that, he unleashed the most dramatic economic transformation in human history. The plan was simple: open special economic zones, small cities where capitalism could experiment. Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Xiamen. Places where foreign investors could build factories without drowning in communist bureaucracy. The pitch to the world was irresistible: unlimited labor, low wages, and a government that would build whatever infrastructure you needed. And the world came running. Japanese electronics firms, American retailers, European automakers. Everyone wanted a piece of China's billion-person workforce. Shenzhen, a fishing village of 30,000, became a city of 12 million in 3 decades. Highways appeared overnight. Power plants multiplied. Entire industrial zones materialized where farms once stood. It wasn't just growth, it was transformation. Peasants who had never seen a factory became factory managers. Rural teenagers became assembly line workers. Provinces that had been backwaters became economic powerhouses. The formula worked so well that every local government wanted to replicate it. Build infrastructure, attract factories, create jobs, repeat. And for 20 years, it was unstoppable. By the early 2000s, China wasn't just competing in global markets, it was dominating them. Steel? China produced more than the next 10 countries combined. Textiles? Entire industries in other countries simply disappeared. Electronics? If it had a circuit board, it was probably assembled in China. The scale was inhuman. Factory cities where a single complex employed 200,000 people. Production lines that never stopped. Shipping containers stacked at ports like Tetris blocks, waiting to flood the world with goods. Western consumers got their miracle: the $5 t-shirt, the $300 smartphone, the illusion that abundance had no cost. But underneath, the incentive structure was starting to crack. Success in China meant one thing: being cheaper than everyone else. Provincial governments competed for factories by offering free land, tax breaks, and subsidized electricity. Companies competed by cutting wages, squeezing suppliers, and slashing margins. Workers competed by accepting 12-hour shifts, 6-day weeks, and wages that would be illegal anywhere else. It was a race to the bottom. But the bottom kept getting deeper. And here's the key: no one could afford to stop. Local governments had borrowed billions to build infrastructure. They needed factories to generate tax revenue to pay back those loans, so they built more factories, which created more supply, which drove prices lower, which meant they needed even more factories to make up the difference. The system had become a treadmill, and the speed kept increasing. By 2015, something had broken. China's steel capacity alone exceeded the rest of the world's total demand. Not production, capacity. They had built so many steel mills that, even running at full speed, they were producing more than the entire planet could use. Prices collapsed, profits vanished. But the mills kept running. Why? Because shutting down meant layoffs, and layoffs meant unrest, and unrest meant political failure. So the government stepped in with subsidies, cheap loans, deferred debt payments, anything to keep the machine moving. This is when a new word started appearing in Chinese economic discussions: Neijuan. In English, involution. It's a term borrowed from anthropology, describing societies that become more complex without actually developing. Spinning faster without moving forward. In China, it describes something darker: students studying 18 hours a day for test scores that barely improved. Office workers competing for promotions that didn't exist. Delivery drivers racing for pennies, while algorithms squeezed every second of productivity from their roots. The system had stopped rewarding excellence. It only punished those who slowed down. And now it was happening to entire industries. Take solar panels. In 2010, China produced 30% of the world's solar panels. By 2023, it was producing 80%. Sounds like dominance, right? But here's what the numbers don't show. Prices fell 40% in a single year. Companies sold below cost just to keep market share. Dozens of manufacturers went bankrupt. And the survivors? They stayed alive by accepting razor-thin margins and hoping volume would save them. It didn't. The same story played out in batteries, in electric vehicles, and consumer electronics. Over 100 Chinese EV brands fighting for a domestic market that could barely support 10, each one cutting prices, each one bleeding cash, each one hoping the others would collapse first. This isn't competition, it's mutual destruction. And the government? It kept the money flowing. Subsidies for factories, tax breaks for manufacturers, cheap loans for companies on the edge of bankruptcy. Not because these businesses were strategically important, but because letting them fail meant admitting the model was broken. Here's the cruel math. In 2024, China's exports hit record highs. Factories shipped more goods than ever before, and industrial profits fell 20%. Read that again. More production, less profit. This is the end game of the race to the bottom. When you compete solely on price, price is the only thing that can fall. Everything else, quality, innovation, wages, investment, gets sacrificed at the altar of volume. Chinese factories are producing more than the world can buy, selling at prices no one can profit from, and calling it growth. But it's not growth, it's inertia. The machine keeps running because stopping is more terrifying than continuing. Local governments can't afford defaults. Banks can't afford write-offs. Workers can't afford unemployment. So everyone pretends that more output equals more success, even when the numbers scream otherwise. Now, some of this is deliberate. China's government isn't stupid. They understand what they're doing. This is strategic flooding. The playbook is simple: subsidize key industries until foreign competitors can't survive. Solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, these aren't just products. They're the infrastructure of the future. If China controls the supply chains for green energy, it controls the 21st century economy. And it's working. European solar manufacturers? Gone. American battery producers? Struggling. The entire Western EV industry? Dependent on Chinese components. Beijing is willing to lose money today to dominate markets tomorrow. It's a bet that Western companies, bound by quarterly earnings and shareholder returns, can't match the patience of state-backed capital. And so far, they've been right. But here's the problem with weaponized efficiency. Eventually, you run out of other people's money. Every dollar spent keeping unprofitable factories alive is a dollar not invested in innovation, not spent on education, not used to build a social safety net. The strategy assumes that once competitors are eliminated, prices can rise and profits can return. But what if they can't? What if the addiction to cheap has become so entrenched that even monopoly can't escape it? And now, add demographics. China's population is shrinking. The workforce is aging. By 2050, there will be more retirees than workers. Who's going to staff these factories? Who's going to buy these products? The entire model was built on endless, cheap labor and growing domestic demand. Both assumptions are collapsing. Birth rates have fallen off a cliff. Young people are refusing to have children because raising a kid in China's hyper-competitive society is financially and emotionally exhausting. The same involution that's killing industries is killing families. And a shrinking population means shrinking consumption, which means even more overcapacity, which means even more desperate price cuts. The trap gets tighter. China isn't the first empire to face this. Rome did. Its vast slave labor estates produced so much grain that prices collapsed, bankrupting the small farmers who were supposed to be the backbone of the republic. Rome optimized agriculture so efficiently it destroyed its own rural economy. And when the empire needed soldiers, there was no one left to recruit. Britain did. Its coal industry flooded global markets so aggressively that even British miners couldn't make a living. The wealth flowed up. The society fractured. Japan did. Its miracle economy in the 1980s hit the same wall: overcapacity, deflation, and an aging population that stopped spending. 30 years later, it still hasn't recovered. The pattern is always the same. Efficiency becomes excess. Excess becomes stagnation, and stagnation becomes decline. Every empire that masters production eventually faces the same question. Can you stop optimizing long enough to survive? China's leaders know all of this. They talk about rebalancing, shifting from investment-driven growth to consumption-driven growth, from manufacturing to services, from quantity to quality. But rebalancing requires pain. It means closing factories, writing off debt, accepting lower GDP numbers. And pain is political suicide. China's social contract is simple. The party delivers growth, and the people accept authoritarian rule. If growth stops, what's left? So instead of rebalancing, they double down. More infrastructure, more subsidies, more debt. They're trapped in a system where the only solution to overproduction is more production. It's like treating obesity with more food. And the rest of the world? They're trapped too. China's industrial deflation is flooding global markets with cheap goods, which sounds great until you realize it's destroying industries everywhere else. European manufacturers can't compete. American factories close. Developing countries can't industrialize because China's already making everything cheaper than they ever could. The world gets affordable products at the cost of its own productive capacity. And when China's system finally breaks, when the debt becomes unsustainable, when the demographics hit, when the subsidies run out, what then? The entire global economy is dependent on Chinese manufacturing. And Chinese manufacturing is dependent on a model that's eating itself. So here's where we are. China built the most efficient manufacturing system in human history, and that efficiency is now destroying the profitability, sustainability, and purpose of the entire system. Factories produce goods no one can afford to buy at prices no one can afford to sell. The government prints money to keep the machine running, and everyone pretends that more output equals more success. But involution doesn't end in victory. It ends in exhaustion. The system will keep running until something breaks. A debt crisis, a political crisis, a social crisis. Or maybe it just grinds slower and slower, like Japan's lost decades, until an entire generation grows old waiting for prosperity that never comes. This is what happens when growth becomes identity, when production replaces purpose, when the only measure of success is how much you can make, regardless of whether anyone needs it. That's not capitalism. That's a treadmill. And the dragon is learning what every empire before it discovered. There's nothing more expensive than being too cheap. Because when you optimize everything except balance, eventually the only thing left to collapse is yourself.